Megan had been working at Sierra Grill for almost a year, and the last few hours felt like a blur of bad tips and impossible customers. The sun was high, pouring through the restaurant windows, casting warm rays across the wooden floors. Carmel, by the sea, had its charm, but that didn't make Megan's job easier. She had enough experience to know that the people who came in often expected a lot, and that was wearing her thin. Her shift had been exhausting from the start. Megan rushed from table to table, balancing orders, complaints, and the growing frustration in her chest. The long line of customers seemed endless, and each interaction felt like another challenge to her patience. When the elderly man walked in, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, she barely noticed him at first. He didn't look like someone who would leave a generous tip or brighten her day. With a sigh, she was assigned to his table. When she approached him, she noticed something peculiar about his presence. His eyes held a quiet confidence, like someone who had lived through years of experience. But Megan dismissed it. She had no time for mysterious types. A simple order was all he gave her. As she took his order, she didn't realize who he was. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the angry, demanding customers she had been dealing with all afternoon. She quickly returned to the kitchen, only to be struck by the nagging feeling that there was something special about this man, something she couldn't quite place. Back in the restaurant, the man's calmness only deepened her curiosity. Megan didn't know it yet, but the man sitting at table 12 was no ordinary customer. He wasn't just someone who'd wander in for a quick bite. He was Clint Eastwood, a name that carried weight in Hollywood, and Megan's chance encounter with him was about to change everything. Clint Eastwood didn't just own the place. He was a man with a reputation. But to Megan, who saw him as nothing more than an old man in worn boots, the real story was only beginning to unfold. This day, one of frustration, would soon give way to a lesson in respect, patience, and the surprise that life sometimes has in store for those who least expect it. Megan returned to table 12 with the man's burger, her movements mechanical. She placed the plate in front of him, the clatter louder than necessary, and a wave of exhaustion washed over her. She had been running on fumes for hours, and the forced smile she gave him wasn't the one she used to greet the occasional friendly face. It was something that barely hid her frustration. The man, however, didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let it show. His composure remained unshaken, as if he were waiting for something only he knew. His polite, "Thank you," held a firmness that Megan couldn't ignore. She didn't know why, but she lingered looking at him. Something about the way he carried himself unsettled her. She had seen all kinds of customers come and go, from demanding to dismissive. But not him. His calmness seemed almost out of place, especially in the whirlwind that was the rest of the restaurant. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just another table. Unable to contain her curiosity, Megan spoke up, trying to break the silence. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, leaning on the table with a smirk. "No, I'm not," he replied simply, cutting his burger with a deliberate calmness that seemed to contrast the chaos surrounding them. The hat was the first clue. She couldn't help herself. "Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie," she said with a shrug, thinking she had him figured out. But to her surprise, he didn't take offense. Instead, a faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Something like that," he replied, his voice steady. Megan, expecting a defensive reaction, was left frustrated by his unflinching calmness. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this man wasn't like the others who complained or demanded attention. He was different. Her impatience boiled over. "You know," she started, lowering her voice like sharing a secret. "Most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." He paused, taking a measured bite of his burger, then responded with a calm that almost seemed intentional. "I guess I'm not most people." The simplicity of his words didn't seem significant at first, but as Megan stood there, it felt like they carried more weight than she expected. His calmness was more than just an attitude. It was a quiet reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and the person sitting before her was not someone to be underestimated. Megan, on the other hand, had a lot to learn from this unexpected encounter. Megan quickly buried the flicker of embarrassment she felt, pushing herself off the table and walking away before the man could say anything else. She was sure she'd gotten the last word, but as she cleared another table nearby, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. His gaze wasn't intrusive or uncomfortable, but it was sharp and assessing, like he was sizing her up. It wasn't the kind of look she was used to from customers, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She tried to brush it off, but there was something about that look, something she couldn't quite place, that made her feel as though her every move was being evaluated. It bothered her more than it should, and it gnawed at her as the hours passed. Little did she know, that moment of silent observation would set the stage for changes in her life she hadn't anticipated. As the lunch rush started to wind down, the atmosphere in Sierra Grill became quieter, and Megan finally had a chance to breathe. She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone while keeping one eye on her remaining tables. Her gaze drifted to table 12, where the man sat, finishing his meal at a leisurely pace. He wasn't in any rush, taking his time, sipping water and glancing around the restaurant with a curiosity that seemed almost intentional. "Hey, Megan!" her co-worker Danny called out, interrupting her thoughts. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? Like he's just taking it all in." Megan shrugged, not in the mood for small talk. "Yeah, well, some people have all the time in the world." Danny chuckled, a playful glint in his eye. "Maybe he's famous or something. He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Famous? Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow but didn't press further, sensing Megan's impatience. Megan wasn't interested in idle speculation. She grabbed the check for table 12 and, determined to keep the interaction brief, walked over to the man's table. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a faint smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the check but didn't immediately reach for it. Instead, his eyes locked onto hers, sharp and calculating. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his voice calm but deliberate. The question caught Megan off guard. It was the last thing she expected from a customer, and she hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. Her practiced smile faltered slightly as she shrugged. "It's fine. It's a job, you know." The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A job's what you make of it, but it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan's cheeks flushed. Who was he to comment on her attitude? She crossed her arms defensively, trying to push the discomfort away. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. He just leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Fair enough," he said simply. Megan stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation shift in unexpected ways. This wasn't the customer interaction she was used to. There was something about the man's quiet wisdom that lingered in the air, and Megan couldn't ignore it. As much as she tried to write him off, she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something she didn't, something she needed to learn. Megan felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. Was he lecturing her? His calm demeanor and his quiet words had struck a nerve, and she was ready to respond, to defend herself. But before she could, he stood up, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, placing a few bills on the table. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, Yeah, whatever, cowboy. She thought the encounter was over and she'd soon be able to get back to her shift. But then, something strange happened. Carol, the manager, a no-nonsense woman who was always in control, hurried out from the back office. The moment she saw the man, her face lit up with recognition and respect. She extended her hand enthusiastically. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't expecting you today," she said, her voice filled with a warmth Megan had never heard her use before. Megan froze. Her stomach dropped as she replayed the name in her head. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. Her eyes widened as she whipped her head toward the door, seeing him turn back briefly to shake Carol's hand. Their eyes met for a split second, and a knowing look passed between them. Before Megan could fully process what was happening, Clint Eastwood walked out the door, leaving her standing there, stunned. It was in that moment that everything clicked. She hadn't just insulted an unassuming customer, she had just insulted Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, and not only that, but the owner of the restaurant. Megan stood frozen in place, her notepad gripped tightly in her hand. Her mind raced. Had she really just brushed off Clint Eastwood, the man whose name she had only ever seen on movie posters or heard in stories? Her heart started pounding, and she felt heat rush to her cheeks. She watched as Carol turned toward her, oblivious to the realization dawning on Megan. "Megan," Carol called, waving her over with a beaming smile. "Can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's been so busy lately, I haven't seen him in weeks." Megan's world felt like it was collapsing in on her. She had no idea how to respond, her thoughts swirling. The Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, had been sitting at her table, and she'd treated him like any other customer. Worse, she'd been rude. As Carol chatted excitedly about Eastwood's visit, Megan stood there, her mind reeling. The man who had so calmly lectured her about her attitude was not just anyone, he was a Hollywood icon. And more than that, he was the very owner of the restaurant she worked for. Yeah, that's... Wow," Megan stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Carol, however, didn't seem to notice the discomfort that was washing over Megan. She was too busy gushing about Clint's involvement in the restaurant. "You know," Carol continued, "this place means the world to him. He's so hands-on. Every detail here is something he's personally approved. That's why we're always reminding staff to bring their best. You never know when he'll stop by." Megan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She replayed every word she'd said to Clint, every snarky comment, every eye roll, and her cheeks burned with humiliation. How could she have been so oblivious? "Are you okay?" Danny asked, noticing Megan's pale face. I think I need a minute," Megan muttered, retreating to the break room. As soon as the door closed behind her, she let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair. How had she not noticed? She'd been working at Sierra Grill for 2 years and had never paid attention to the stories about the mysterious owner. If she had, maybe she'd have recognized Clint, or at the very least thought twice, before running her mouth. Her mind spun in circles, but one thought kept repeating. What now? The question gnawed at her, and though she didn't have the answers, she knew her life at the restaurant would never be the same. The next day, Megan arrived at work with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She hadn't slept well, haunted by the events of the previous day. Every time she thought about Clint Eastwood's calm demeanor, the way he looked at her as he left, she cringed. What if he had told Carol about her attitude? What if she got fired? She couldn't afford to lose her job, not with rent due in 2 weeks and her student loans piling up. The first half of her shift passed in a blur. She avoided eye contact with Carol, focusing instead on making sure her customers were happy. Smiling, apologizing, refilling drinks before anyone had to ask. It was the most effort she'd put into her job in months. By the time lunch rolled around, The restaurant was buzzing with activity. Megan was wiping down a table when she heard the unmistakable gravelly voice that had been haunting her thoughts. "Well, looks like you're busy today." She turned sharply to see Clint Eastwood standing near the counter, his hands casually resting in his pockets. He was dressed similarly to the day before, but today his presence seemed even more commanding. Her heart sank. She forced a nervous smile, trying to think of something to say. Mr. Eastwood, hi. I didn't know you'd be back so soon." Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I like to check in on my places from time to time," he said, his voice smooth but with a hint of something that made Megan feel even more on edge. "Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed hard, her palms suddenly sweaty. "Right, well, everything's running great today," she said, her voice a little shaky. Clint gave a small nod and glanced around the restaurant. "I see that, but you seem a little tense," he observed. Megan froze. Of course he noticed. He probably noticed everything, the sarcasm, the attitude, the way she'd brushed him off. The day before, he held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," Clint said calmly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." She blinked, caught off guard by his response. "You're not?" she asked, her voice unsure. "No," he replied, his voice steady. "But I do think there's a lesson here. You never know who you're talking to or what they might be going through. A little kindness goes a long way." Megan's throat tightened, unsure of how to respond, so she simply nodded, feeling a lump form in her chest. She didn't have to say anything more. Clint continued, his tone softening. "Look, I've had bad days too. But the way you handle those days says a lot about who you are, and trust me, people notice." Megan could feel her face turning red. His words weren't harsh, but they cut deeper than any scolding ever could. He wasn't trying to embarrass her, he was trying to teach her something she needed to learn. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean it," he added with a small smile. "You're welcome," Clint said. "Just remember, every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well." With that, he tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Megan standing there. Overwhelmed by a mix of emotions, she felt something stir inside her, something unexpected. The desire to be better. Over the next few weeks, Megan couldn't shake Clint's words. They replayed in her mind every time she stepped onto the restaurant floor. Every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well. At first, she didn't know how to start making changes. She wasn't the type to flash fake smiles or gush over customers like some of her co-workers did. But Clint's calm demeanor, his quiet wisdom, it had struck a chord. She didn't have to pretend to be someone she wasn't. She just needed to show a little more patience, a little more care. So, she started small. When a frazzled mom with 3 kids spilled a soda across the table, Megan didn't sigh or roll her eyes. Instead, she grabbed a rag, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, it happens to the best of us." When an elderly couple asked her to repeat the specials 3 times, she didn't let her frustration show. She patiently explained them again, even adding her own recommendations. And the thing that surprised her the most was how much better she felt the more effort she put into treating people kindly. Megan's stomach twisted with nerves as she stepped into the office, fearing the worst. Carol was sitting behind the desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "You've been working here for a while," Carol began, her voice steady, "and I've noticed a change in you lately." Megan blinked, unsure of what to expect. Carol's next words caught her off guard. "A good one," she added with a small smile. Megan's heart skipped. "Oh, thank you," she stammered. I don't know what brought it on." Carol continued, "But whatever you're doing, keep it up. The customers have noticed too. One of them even left a comment card the other day, praising your service." Megan felt her chest swell with a mix of pride and disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her efforts, let alone acknowledge them. As she left the office, a smile tugged at her lips. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. That night, as she locked up the restaurant, she glanced at the sign out front. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she could grow, learn, and maybe even make a difference. And she owed it all to the quiet cowboy who'd walked in one busy afternoon and taught her a lesson she'd never forget. Because sometimes, the smallest interactions have the biggest impact, and every moment is a chance to become someone better.